At a moment of panic when we were there on Friday, I got hearing aids. And I don't know how it's going to work out because I told everybody, including my wife, the only thing I can hear better now is me, which I don't think is what we were going for. But there was a moment there where I had my hearing aids on and I'm singing, and I thought my whole voice was projecting out into the congregation, which made me a little afraid. So anyway, this is the third Sunday of Advent. Joy is the theme of the day. Lindsay and I had an interesting exchange after I delivered the first sermon of Advent on hope. After listening to my sermon, she said, "Thanks for taking all the material. All you talked about that entire sermon was peace. You didn't even say hope in the whole thing. So now, how am I going to talk about peace? Or what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to make up for you and talk about hope?" So, like Jesus, I poured through my entire sermon and opened her eyes to the wisdom of my words, of where hope was coming through there, and she was not necessarily buying it. But the problem is these words, the two words are rooted together so deeply. Hope and peace, they're just intimately linked together. And peace is often the thing we hope for most. It's different with joy. We can experience joy and laughter even when life is its most stressed. Matter of fact, laughter and joking around is a way we handle anxiety and stress. So a quick review of the previous weeks. I was thinking about this after our event yesterday when we talked about hope. The summary of hope is embracing the truth that there are alternative ways for us to live with each other. We can choose swords, or we can beat those swords into plowshares and give every heart, home, and community a vine and a fig tree to dwell under in peace and unafraid. Biblical peace, as Lindsay pointed out, is something more than an absence of conflict. The peace Isaiah proclaims is similar to wholeness. We find peace when all the fragmented, disassociated parts of our life find their proper place, and we feel complete. From generation to generation today's theme is joy, but I am still stuck on last Sunday. Last Sunday was the 74th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Last Sunday was December 7th. December 7th, 1941, also fell on a Sunday. On that Sunday in 1941, as people in Minnesota were leaving their church worship services, after they listened to a sermon on peace, 353 Japanese aircraft began a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Ironically, the people leaving that day would have listened to the same words from Isaiah 11 that we heard last week. And then the very next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress because he needed approval of Congress to send the country into war. And he opened his speech with the words we all know, or we should at least know. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. All week long, as I prepared this sermon, I could not help but think and wonder, how did preachers preach on joy that Sunday morning, December 14th, 1941. They had to get in front of the people and talk about Advent and joy as 2,400 Americans were dead and another 1,700 were wounded. Recruiting offices across the nation exploded with young men, some even boys, enlisting to defend their country, to travel to distant lands, to be killed or to kill. How does one speak of joy when the world around you seems so bleak. Mrs. Walton was my fourth grade teacher, and she was one of the original Rosie the Riveters. She used to talk about it with such amazing pride. She would show us pictures of her working in a Cleveland factory and talk about her building bombers for the cause. Her job, the one that gave her great pride and joy, was to assemble tools of war so boys could win and come home. I'm sure on December 14th, joy was not in her heart. When all was said and done, I know she looked back on that time with amazing pride and joy. I know it because she talked about it all the time. Whenever we earned free time in the fourth grade, she would play for us the records of old radio shows from the 40s that you would listen to in World War II, and I just loved listening to those shows. The Lone Ranger, Fibber McGee and Molly, Little Orphan Annie, and my favorite, The Shadow. I remember her playing records of radio reports on activities of the troops. She openly talked about the dry wilderness of uncertainty and fear she felt, listening to them as a younger woman. As children, we knew the outcome. So listening to those reports of troop movements were so exciting and fascinating. But if I had been listening to them as a child and I didn't know the outcome, they would have just consumed my heart in absolute fear. I would have been terrified. Years later, when I was in high school, I was a senior, and Mr. Straley was in his last year of teaching, and he shared with us his experiences of being an infantry soldier in the Pacific. His words were less joy, but there were wisdoms in his words from a man who seen a lot in his life. The joy he possessed was the thrill of making it out alive to enjoy a world of peace, even if that peace seems sometimes fleeting. The older I get, the more thankful I am for that generation speaking to me. For that generation speaking to me both about the dryness of a parched landscape and the joy that comes when streams of peace start to flow. Now, my apologies to you if you came here expecting a happy sermon. For a day whose theme is joy, you would think that would be the case. But in my defense, the scriptures this Sunday, the assigned scriptures for Advent, are not filled with a lot of happy things. Don't be afraid is the key phrase in both the text coming out of Luke, which talks about Mary's visitation, and in Isaiah's prophecy. Happy people usually are not worried about being afraid. They're too happy for that kind of stuff. Asking you to consider the lives of Americans on December 14th, 1941 is completely appropriate way to invite you into Isaiah's audience. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah is filled with destruction and absolute despair. Even if you were to go back at home today and read chapter 34, oh my gosh, is that a bleak chapter. His world was worse than the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Babylonian Empire was coming and would destroy Israel and Judah. And the reason for their destruction, according to Isaiah, was their faithlessness. And in the midst of this pending darkness, out of the absolute blue comes Isaiah chapter 35. It's as if God knew the people needed to hear some hopeful news, a promise of joy to come. Isaiah's audience could see the desolation. They just couldn't see the springs of water. But like what Mrs. Walton and Mr. Straley did for me and my classmate, someone needs to speak about both the apparent hopelessness and the promise that we will endure and we will find joy. I don't know if you can do this. Jake, could you put up verse 4 on the screen from a reading? Verse 4 is actually an invitation to us who are gathered here today. Say to those who are panicking. What's really interesting about this is the Hebrew phrase literally translated as speak to those whose hearts are racing. I was reading a commentary on Isaiah this week by an Old Testament professor from Duke University Divinity School, Anathea Portier-Young. She talked about the psychological or physiological nature of a racing heart. That adrenaline pumps epinephrine through your bloodstream, and it narrows our focus and energizes us to fight when there is an obvious threat. But our minds can play trick on us. They can play tricks on us into feeling threatened. Then, the very thing that equips you and energizes us to fight can have the opposite effect. It forces us into paralysis. She added, for most of us, the world we now live in bombards our nervous systems with stimuli or stressors almost constantly. The danger is not usually acute, but our bodies have a limited repertoire for dealing with stress. A response that may, in extreme danger, help save our lives, more often breaks us down. So someone needs to speak and say to those who are paralyzed in fear, be strong, do not fear, here's your God. We jumped into the next words of the coming vengeance and the divine retribution. And we talked about this on our Tuesday at 10 Bible study, and no one in the class, including me, liked those words. They didn't like even hearing those words. But again, here's where the original Hebrew paints a different picture than our English translations and meanings and how we've heard those words, because people sometimes twist the words of the Bible. The word for vengeance in Hebrew is about retribution by a legitimate authority who will bring freedom to those who are oppressed. And this kind of vengeance is not about exacting revenge on people. It is about restoring a just and fair world. In similar fashion, retribution is not about punishment, like God will come and smite you. It literally means God's dealing. God's the acting agent. So we could faithfully read this verse 4 this way. Be strong, do not fear. Here's your God. God will change the course of destruction and restore God's creation. Just watch God work. Supporting these words is the rest of the text of Isaiah. It's kind of amazing when you look through it. The then statements describe that restoration happening. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and then the ears of the deaf will be cleared. Then the lame will leap like the deer, and the tongue of the speechless will sing. Those will statements describe God's work. When God is at work, the burning sand will become a pool, and the thirsty ground, fountains of water. Jackals' habitat, a pasture, grass will become reeds and rushes. Good things will happen when God is at work, and those good things will place an everlasting joy upon their heads. I laughed at one day that Cal got up after one of my sermons, said you could boil it down to this. So ever since Cal got up and said that, I've been thinking about how would I boil this sermon down to a simpler statement. And thank you for that. There is a simpler way to preach the sermon. We could sum it up this way. Don't be afraid, even though threats are real. You are not alone. A loving God walks with you, abides within you, and this presence can turn your fear into everlasting joy. I was thinking about that and a gift a friend of mine gave. A gentleman that I worked for in New York, who eventually became the bishop of Milwaukee for the Lutheran Church, who's now living in Farmington and serving in a church there. We've been able to reconnect. He's a loving kind of goofball. He's a Montana simple guy. And sometimes you have to wait for a long time for him to speak because the words come out so slow. But when he speaks, I've been amazed at his brilliance. And I found a document he had given to me years ago. It was 10 Commandments for Camp Counselors. And it became something I read to our staff every year and gave that to them to guide their life after camp was over. But I was thinking about the 10th commandment this week. The 10th commandment is this: do not be anxious about your life. And Jeff wrote, my dad said so very little about his experience in World War II. Thus, I remember vividly the night he told me about being on a ship in the middle of the Pacific when suddenly they were surrounded by a fleet of Japanese destroyers. He simply said, I was afraid, I cried, then I prayed. And I've never been afraid like that again. For my dad, it was not whether he was spared as much as it was a matter of discovering that he was not alone, which brought him great comfort and strength. Jeff continues to write, if there's nothing else this summer, if you discover one thing that you can keep, not for fleeting weeks, not for months, but for a lifetime, it is that wonderful sense that you are not alone in the world. Your most noble accomplishments, your most miserable failings, your excessive pride and your nagging self-doubts will all pale in comparison to having shared the company of a God who's always been there for you, who's never been able to look at us with anything other than loving eyes. If you somehow begin to comprehend the truth of that promise and live it, you'll begin to touch the desperately searching souls of your campers with news that life is a gift and not a burden. Camp and working with children was more reality than the outside professional adult world. It would always get me so angry that those young adults that would work with kids in the summer who found such amazing joy by being grounded in prayer and scripture and service, their lives exploded in joy, and then they would just abandon it as soon as they left camp and couldn't understand why the world was so miserable. So I'll leave you with this as a path to joy. If you begin to comprehend the truth of that promise and live it, that you are not alone, you will begin to touch all the desperately searching souls in your life, the souls of others and of yourself, with the news that life is a great gift of inexpressible joy. It is not a burden to fear. But here's the challenge. It's hard to discover this living for yourself. It's so hard to do. You have to engage with others. You have to be open to willing and to engage with the world around you. It is why the people who work for 360 Communities, Emma Norton, the Open Door, People Incorded, while they carry a heavy burden on their shoulders of working with people that are desperate and lost in this world, they are some of the most joy-filled people, because every day they're helping people see that they are not alone in the world. So at Christmas Eve, we'll have an offering. We'll collect up money. We'll give to 360s. We'll give that to Emma Norton. And it's an invitation for us to join in their joy, to give an expression to a hope-starved, joy-starved world that they're not alone. And we will all, through this, learn the joy of living out God's will for all creation. Amen.